This was all in secret, essentially.
So some unelected person at the FBI talks to some unelected person at the state level, and they say, yeah, go ahead. Here's, in the case of Ohio, we got 11 million people, most of them drive. Here's 10 million folks who you can now have this database.
Right, and the people who wanted a driver's license many times didn't know these systems were operating either.
And I don't know about you, but I have a driver's license, and I don't remember ever being told that getting a driver's license would put me in an FBI database so that I can be a part of every one of their investigation lineups. And I certainly didn't vote for anyone who was promising to make that happen.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. If you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, friend, and thank you for listening to the 214th episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. And if this is your first time listening to Congressional Dish, hello. I am your nerdy neighbor who watches Congress all the time. I watch congressional hearings and I actually read the laws. And I do these crazy things because I want to know what's going on with our tax money and what they are doing in our names. And so I started doing this about 8 years ago and I'm still doing it, which is crazy. I know. But for this episode, I decided to get away from the craziness that is COVID-19 for an episode, because the last 3 episodes have been about it, and pretty much our whole lives have been about it for the last 2 months, and I'm a little sick of it. Plus, there was also the little issue of the fact that after the CARES Act became law, Congress was on vacation. So there was like 6 weeks there where there was no Congress for me to watch. And so what I did is I went back to a project that I started last summer about facial recognition software. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, because there have actually been some hearings in 2020. In the show notes for this episode, I have provided all the sound clips and timestamps of not just the clips you're going to hear today. There were actually a lot more that I collected for this episode, but I watched, I think, 7 hearings, something like that, going over the course of 9 months, and just found out a lot about facial recognition software and how it's being used in the United States, mainly by law enforcement, but there's some other stories in here too. But as always, with every single episode I do of Congressional Dish, you don't have to trust me. I don't expect you to trust me. Who the hell am I? And so I give you all the sources in the show notes. And so again, you do have the links to the hearings if you want to watch them in full. I give you the timestamps so you can see all of these clips in context. And then I also give you all of the articles and documents that I used for the research in this episode. So if you hear me say something and you go, "What? That can't be true. I don't believe that." Well, you can go to my show notes and find out where I'm getting it from. I think that's one of the most important things that I do. Also very important is you will hear no advertisements in this show, even though this is my full-time job. It is my career. But I don't accept advertising for this show because there's many reasons. Mainly, I hate advertisements. I don't want to listen to them. I know you don't want to. But it also changes my relationship with you if I accepted advertisements, because the advertising model, I would be making money by selling your time to companies, and I just don't want to do that. So instead, I am producing a show for you, with you, because you're my producers. And so instead of selling your time, what I do is I ask you to produce the show by sending in whatever amount this show is worth to you. And I leave the amount up to you. I leave the kind of payment you send in up to you. We accept paper checks. People send those whenever they feel like it, or monthly, weekly, bi-weekly. We also accept PayPal, Zelle, Cash App, Venmo. And if you want to pay per episode, we do have a Patreon. And if you contribute on Patreon, you also get a feed with no golf swings over my bad words, because you might not know this, but if you have an explicit tag on your podcast, there are some countries, some of them very large, like China and India, where you can't be listed in the Apple directory. And because this is a show designed for all American voters, and there are American voters in those countries, I do want this to be available all over the world. And so that's what the golf swings are all about. But if you don't like the golf swings, contribute on Patreon and they go away. So thank you to all the producers of this episode and every episode that I've done so far. I would not still be doing this without you. But yes, let's get started with our main story today, which is how the government and others are using facial recognition technology. Because I've got to tell you, when I started down this rabbit hole, I was really just interested in how they were using it when we were flying. So I started looking into global entry and TSA, and I'm actually not going to get into that today because there was nothing all that interesting there. What ended up happening, though, is by watching all these hearings, I found out about all these different ways that the software is being used. I had no idea, but the government definitely does have this technology. They're using it in many different ways, and they're expanding the use of it rapidly. Now, when this issue is discussed at all, a lot of times the focus is on the accuracy of the software. And that's fair because the government isn't actually providing this technology. The technology is provided by private companies. But the government is the customer of these private companies, and they're using this technology to identify U.S. taxpayers. And so the government does do testing to make sure that the software works sometimes. But here's an example of what is happening when they're doing these tests. So the following clip is testimony in the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. This is from January of this year. And you're going to hear from Charles Romine. He's the director of the Information Technology Laboratory at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is the part of our government that does tests of facial recognition software and all sorts of other technology. But in this clip, he's going to tell us about the results of some of their recent tests, and he's going to use an insider jargon phrase that I want you to understand before you hear this. And so when he talks about one-to-one verification, that's when facial recognition is used to match a person's face to one photo. So for example, if you have global entry for flying internationally, when you get to customs, you put your passport into a little machine and it takes a picture of you. Well, facial recognition software is then used to make sure that your face in the photo that they just took matches the picture on the passport. That's an example of one-to-one applications of facial recognition software. There's another kind of application for facial recognition software, which is one-to-many. In that application, they're matching a person's face to a database with lots of photos trying to find a match. But just to give you an example of some of the current accuracy issues, here's Charles Romine talking about the results of their tests on some of the one-to-one facial recognition software applications.
I'll first address one-to-one verification applications. Their false positive differentials are much larger than those related to false negative and exist across many of the algorithms tested. False positives might present a security concern to the system owner as they may allow access to imposters. Other findings are that false positives are higher in women than in men and are higher in the elderly and the young compared to middle-aged adults. Regarding race, we measured higher false positive rates in Asian and African American faces relative to those of Caucasians. There are also higher false positive rates in Native American, American Indian, Alaskan Indian, and Pacific Islanders. These effects apply to most algorithms, including those developed in Europe and the United States. However, a notable exception was for some algorithms developed in Asian countries. There was no such dramatic difference in false positives in one-to-one matching between Asian and Caucasian faces for algorithms developed in Asia. While the NIST study did not explore the relationship between cause and effect, one possible connection and an area for research is the relationship between an algorithm's performance and the data used to train the algorithm itself.
Which is kind of fascinating because what this result would indicate is that if you, for example, have a bunch of white tech bros creating the software and algorithms, the software and algorithms are pretty good at identifying white tech bros. But it's not as good at identifying our beautiful brown sisters. And it kind of makes sense, you know, like the algorithms are going to be good at what they know. And so the bottom line here is that there's some work to do on accuracy. But more importantly, when it comes to testing this software, we have a problem in that the testing is voluntary.
We don't test for specific companies on their behalf. We test or evaluate the algorithms that are submitted to us through this voluntary program.
The problem with the government testing being voluntary for private facial recognition software companies is that the government is buying their products. And there's nothing in the law right now that's requiring the government to test the accuracy before the government buys their products. So for example, the FBI has facial recognition software. And here's how careful the FBI was when they purchased this technology from the private sector. This is Greta Goodwin. She's from the Government Accountability Office. She was testifying to the House Committee on Oversight and Reform in June of 2019.
We also reported on accuracy concerns about FBI's face recognition capabilities. Specifically, we found that the FBI conducted limited assessments of the accuracy of the face recognition searches before they accepted and deployed the technology. For example, the face recognition system generates a list of the requested number of photos. The FBI only assessed accuracy when users requested a list of 50 possible matches. It did not test smaller list sizes, which might have yielded different results. Additionally, these tests did not specify how often incorrect matches were returned. Knowing all of this, the FBI still deployed the technology.
So first things first, we need a law that at the very least requires the government to test the software that they're buying to use against us citizens. Because the tech companies are keeping secrets from our government, from us, their clients. So here's Claire Garvey. You're going to hear from her a lot today. She's the senior associate at the Center on Privacy and Technology at Georgetown's Law School. And she was testifying to the House Committee on Government Oversight and Reform in May of 2019.
Law enforcement agencies don't typically have access to the training data or to how the algorithms work as well, because these are private companies that have developed these systems, and it's considered a trade secret.
The companies that sell this technology to the government should be required to give the government far more information than the no information that they're required to give the government right now. The companies should be given a choice. If they want to make large profits off of something paid for with our tax money, they can give us the information that will help us protect the public. Or they can sell their products strictly to the private sector and keep their precious trade secrets. That's the choice that they can make in the free market. Because as a collection of taxpayers, we are allowed to put strings on our purchases, and we have immense purchasing power, and we can and should use it. And so let's take a real life example of a company that is partnering with our government to provide facial recognition capabilities. And I'm sure you've heard of a little company called Amazon, because Amazon has facial recognition software that they're selling to our government. And right up front, because this is a podcast and I have committed to tell you my biases where they lie. Well, here's my bias when it comes to Amazon. Amazon, in my opinion, has unethical leadership, and I think the company is dangerous. This is a company that has been forcing its employees to work during the COVID-19 crisis without taking adequate safety precautions for the employees. It's a company that even before the crisis has treated its human employees as expendable robots. And yes, those shady motherfuckers owe me over $800 in commissions that they kept after abruptly deleting my partnership account about a month before Christmas in either 2015 or 2016. All the years are kind of molding together at this point in my memory. But I do remember this happening, and I do remember they killed my account and David Pakman's account on the same day, and a bunch of other political people were demonetized around the same time. And even though they have the right to choose who they do business with, the fact that they kept the money that we had already earned is bullshit. And yes, I'm still angry about it. And I had no way to fight them because our corporate congresses of my entire lifetime, they have given the corporate titans a sneaky form of legal immunity from lawsuits by allowing them to put arbitration clauses in their fine print, which limit our right to sue companies in normal courts. These arbitration clauses are in every contract that I've read, and you know that I'm that weirdo in your life that actually would read a contract. And most people don't even know those clauses are in there until they get wronged by some huge corporation and find out that they're not allowed to sue the company and instead have to go to some not a court where the company gets to pick the judge. It's really fucked up, and that's a rabbit hole for another day. But the point is that Amazon has owed me money for years, and so I do have some Amazon in my soul. But this is bigger than me because none of my hesitations about Amazon have gone away the more I've learned about Amazon, because more and more Amazon is merging and becoming an essential part of our government. So for example, in 2017, Amazon created a cloud where all 17 agencies of the intelligence communities now store their information. This plan was invented by James Clapper, who is Obama's director of national intelligence, who we all know committed the crime of perjury when he lied to Congress about collecting our data.
Does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?
No, sir.
Liar, liar, pants on fire. And now all of the data that they collect is being stored on Amazon servers. And so the way I see it is that the CIA basically merged with Amazon on Clapper's watch. Because think of what data storage is. Having access to data storage gives you access to secrets. And Amazon is now trusted with the CIA's secrets. And not just the CIA, the entire intelligence community. And so this is a merger of some sorts of a corporation and the secret government. And so Amazon and the CIA, in my mind, since 2017, are basically the same thing. And when it comes to new facial recognition software, Amazon's Ring is working with law enforcement. The extent of that is something that Congress wants to investigate, which I know because right before COVID got real, the House Committee on Oversight and Reform sent a letter to Amazon requesting documents about Ring. And for those of you who don't know, Ring is a company that Amazon bought in 2018, and the products sold are cameras that are installed next to people's doorbells and within their homes. Now, Ring advertises that it's to combat package theft and to help people find their lost pets and for information sharing during emergencies. And actually, the first time I became aware that this technology even existed is when I watched the doorbell camera footage in order to hear Kobe Bryant's helicopter crash. Before that awful day, I didn't know that this technology was a thing. And actually, that's kind of crazy. Now that I look at it, this letter from Congress to Amazon about Ring is from the week that Kobe died. So, yikes. But this is all very recent, is my point in that. I mean, Kobe died January 26th. And so this is all 2020 stuff that's going on. But the cameras that people are willingly installing at their front doors and in their homes for Ring, well, those go along with the Neighbors Act, which Ring describes as, quote, the new neighborhood watch, unquote. The Neighbors app gives people real-time crime alerts from other peasants and law enforcement agencies in their community. So it's like a narc forum with a police scanner. The letter from Congress expresses concerns that Amazon has signed contracts with local law enforcement agencies. And in these arrangements, Ring has the most control. The corporation is the alpha dog. So, for example, Congress wants to investigate reports that Ring controls what cities and law enforcement agencies can say to the public about Ring, meaning that governments have to get Amazon's approval of any of their public statements. The government, the entity of leaders elected by the people, is always supposed to be the most powerful in a government-corporation relationship. And so when corporations become more powerful than the government, that's a major shift. It's a whole different form of government, one that prioritizes profit over the common good. And I mean, I think COVID is showing us that shift is advanced already, but Amazon dictating what the police can tell the public, that's a level worth being worried about. Also, I just want to mention this as a dot that I haven't connected to anything, but I just want to put it out there. Because Ring's tech bros, the ones that make the Ring system work, that have access to the videos and are working on facial recognition features, they're based in Ukraine. And I bring this up just because anytime Ukraine pops up, I like to mental note it. After seeing, Obama and Biden really replacing the Ukrainian government in 2014. And then just this year, the Democrats impeached Trump over a delay in Ukraine war money. And now Amazon / the CIA is selling a technology developed in Ukraine to our law enforcement to scan our faces. Just dots. I'm just collecting dots. And I don't know if any of these are connected, but there's another Ukraine dot for our brain banks. But big picture, Amazon partnering with law enforcement and setting the rules of that relationship is evidence of an erosion of government, of corporations gaining governing power. But the local level picture, when you look at it just like your neighborhood cops and the relationship that this gives them to their communities, the narc forum gives the actual cops a much wider system of surveillance than they could ever build themselves. because the neighborhood narcs are giving the cops private information. And if someone in the narc network doesn't want to turn the information over, the cops can then just go straight to Amazon to get the videos that they want. In a letter from Amazon to Senator Ed Markey's office, Amazon said that police officers in communities that have contracts with Amazon can request up to 12 hours of video from anyone within a half a square mile of a suspected crime scene covering a 45-day time span. And they can make these requests without a warrant. And the cops love this. Of course they do. So much so that the local governments are giving out discounted rings. There's a lot of this actually going on in my state of California. And so the local level cops are clearly not too focused on our government big picture morphing into full-blown corporatism, as long as their day-to-day jobs get easier and us surveilling ourselves with these video cameras, we're definitely making their jobs a little bit easier. And when I say that a lot of local governments are doing this, as of the beginning of this year, Ring has partnered with 770 police departments. And so that's the part of Amazon that has the cameras installed. Amazon also owns a company called Rekognition, which specializes in, you guessed it, facial recognition. The images used for recognition are stored on the Amazon Web Services Cloud that the CIA and all the other intelligence goons use to store their data too. And so all this data is in the same spot. And we, in reality, have absolutely no way to know just how separated the Amazon and the intelligence data is. But in terms of technical capabilities, Amazon brags that it can scan the images in the picture database. And then Amazon's person tracking, that's a quote, person tracking, can identify up to 100 people in a single picture by uploading it into a database featuring tens of millions of faces against real-time footage that can come from police body cameras and also public and private cameras like Ring cameras. And Amazon has been asked repeatedly if they plan to add their facial recognition features from their Rekognition company into the Ring narc network. And Amazon has said, yes, it's possible. Now, some ways that we already know that Amazon's facial recognition service is being used is that, for instance, Sky News used it to identify guests of the royal wedding, showing that journalists, regardless of whether they're ethical or not, are able to buy facial recognition software to write stories about people. And we also know, of course, that Amazon's recognition is being used by law enforcement. This is Representative Jimmy Gomez of California speaking in a hearing in May of 2019.
Until February of this year, Amazon had not submitted its controversial facial recognition technology Rekognition to third-party testing with the National Institute of Standards and Technology, known as NIST. In a January 2019 blog post, Amazon stated that, quote, Amazon Rekognition can't be downloaded for testing outside of Amazon. In short, Amazon would not submit to outside testing of their algorithm, despite the fact that Amazon had not submitted its facial recognition product to outside testing. It still sold that product to police departments. In 2017, police in Washington County, Oregon started using Amazon Rekognition technology.
And even though Amazon's a big player in this game, I do want to point out that they're far from the only one. So for example, Microsoft has its own version called Facial Recognition API, and there are plenty of other lesser known companies selling this technology as well. And so, knowing that there's a bunch of players in this game, how widespread is the use of facial recognition technology by law enforcement? Well, this is Representative Jamie Raskin of Maryland speaking to Claire Garvey. She's the person from the Center on Privacy and Technology at Georgetown Law School. Here they are discussing that in May of 2019.
What's the minimum, you think?
So we can estimate conservatively that face recognition, generally both used as an investigative tool and potentially as a surveillance tool, is accessible to at very least a quarter of all law enforcement agencies across the U.S. That's a conservative estimate because it's based on 300 or so records requests where there are 18,000 law enforcement agencies across the country.
And the plain fact is that we don't know the full extent.
We are now seeing that most companies that develop facial recognition systems offer also real-time software. Do we know how many of these are selling their technology to government actors in the United States?
That's right. Most, if not all, companies that market face recognition to law enforcement in the U.S. also advertise the ability to do face surveillance. We have no idea how widespread this is, thanks to a fundamental absence of transparency. We have limited visibility into what Chicago's doing, what Detroit's doing, Orlando, the Secret Service here in Washington, D.C., and in New York, thanks to FOIA records and investigative journalists' work. But for a vast majority of jurisdictions, we have no idea.
So local law enforcement agencies are using facial recognition technology for sure. And some of them may be using real-time identifying technology, but the thing is, it's not just local. The feds are using it too. So this is then Representative Mark Meadows of North Carolina, who, by the way, is no longer in Congress because he's now Trump's chief of staff. But in this hearing back in June of 2019, he was still a congressman, and he was questioning Kimberly Del Greco, who is the Deputy Assistant Director for the Criminal Justice and Information Services Division of the FBI.
Is you mentioned about not having any real-time systems. And yet we had testimony just a couple of weeks ago from Georgetown that indicated the Chicago Police Department, Detroit Police Department has real-time. They purchased it where they're actually taking real-time images. Do they ping the FBI to validate what they've picked up in real time with what you have on your database?
I mean, there are authorized law enforcement entities that have access to our system.
So law enforcement at all levels have this technology, and they're working together to use it. And here's the repercussions of that. Here's Claire Garvey again.
Face recognition gives law enforcement a power that they've never had before. And this power raises questions about our Fourth and First Amendment protections. Police can't secretly fingerprint a crowd of people from across the street. They also can't walk through that crowd, demanding that everybody produce their driver's license. But they can scan their faces remotely and in secret and identify each person thanks to face recognition technology.
And now we know they've done exactly that. Here's Meredith Whitaker. She's the co-founder and co-director of the AI Now Institute, testifying to the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform in January of this year.
Because the Baltimore PD was using private sector technologies. They were scanning Instagram photos through a service called Geofeedia that gave them feeds from Freddie Gray protests. They then were matching those photos against their faces facial recognition algorithm, which is a privately developed facial recognition algorithm, to identify people with warrants whom they could then potentially harass.
And it's not just in protests where this can and is being used. They can use it to identify us in our everyday lives. And an example of that is Project Greenlight. When you Google Project Greenlight, you get some information on a canceled HBO show about Matt Damon and Ben Affleck, that asshole from Fashionable Mail. But eventually you'll find the version of Project Greenlight, which is Detroit's camera network, which began in 2016 and now has 24/7 recordings from thousands of cameras at gas stations, restaurants, mini-marts, apartment buildings, churches, and schools. The cameras are meant to be noticed. They're huge and they have big green lights and are marketed to peasants as being crime stoppers. But really, it's very Big Brother. And Detroit officials want to expand the network to include hundreds of traffic light cameras as well. And people were unhappy enough about the existence of these cameras, or at least some people. But months of angry protests were triggered when people found out that images from those cameras were being used by Detroit cops for facial recognition-based searches. And there's a lot of concern about the fact that Detroit has the technical capability to track people in real time. And here's why. Here's Claire Garvey again.
We see China as a bit of a roadmap of what's possible with this technology in the absence of rules. And in the absence of rules, this is a system where everybody is enrolled in the back end, and there are enough cameras to allow law enforcement to track where somebody is anytime they show their face in public, to upload their photo and see where they've been over the last 2 weeks, be that public rallies or an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting or a rehab clinic. That information is now available at the click of a button or the upload of a photo. That's what face recognition looks like with no rules.
And right now, we have a complete absence of federal rules. And in that absence, there are cities in this country that have purchased a technology that makes that kind of surveillance possible. Here's Claire Garvey.
Our research has found that at least two major jurisdictions, Chicago and Detroit, have purchased this capability and have paid to maintain it. Chicago says they do not use it. Detroit did not deny that they were using it. Theirs is designed to operate with Project Greenlight, which is specifically locations like, yes, gas stations and liquor stores, but also churches and clinics and schools.
But like I said before, this isn't limited to local law enforcement. If you're not in Chicago or Detroit or any of the other cities that you've heard listed so far, you're not immune from this. Far from it, because the FBI is using this technology. And here's what they say they use it for. Here's Kimberly Del Greco of the FBI again.
The FBI's policy and procedures emphasize that photo candidates returned are not to be considered positive identification, that the searches are photos and will only result in a ranked listing of candidates.
So they say they use it to generate leads, but where do they get the photos from? Here's Representative Elijah Cummings of Maryland, or I should say former representative. Unfortunately, he's passed away. But here's Representative Cummings asking some questions of Kimberly Del Greco of the FBI.
Ms. Del Greco, can you explain how the FBI decides to search a state database versus when it searches its own system, and how this policy is determined?
I would be happy to explain that. At the FBI, we have a service called Face Services Unit. They process background checks and process facial recognition searches of the state DMV photos. They do this in accordance with the Attorney General guidelines. An FBI field office has to have an open assessment or an active investigation. They submit the probe photo to the FBI Face Services Unit. We launch the search to the state. The state runs the search for the FBI and provides a candidate list back.
So what that means is if you have a driver's license, the FBI has access to your photo, and your state is doing the dirty work of looking through the photos for them. And so what that means in reality is if the FBI is doing an investigation, that means any of us with a driver's license could be in the lineup. And so how is this possible? Well, here's Representative Cummings still speaking to Kimberly Del Greco. And just so you know, when she says MOU, that stands for Memorandum of Understanding, which is an agreement.
Do individuals who consent to having their faces in the non-criminal databases also consent to having their faces searched by the FBI for criminal investigations? For example, when applying for a driver's license, does someone consent at the DMV to being in a database searchable by the FBI?
The FBI worked diligently with the state representatives in each of the states that we have MOUs. Mm-hmm. We did so under the state's authority to allow photos to be used for criminal investigations. We also abided by the Federal Driver's License Privacy Protection Act, and we consider that a very important process for us to access those photos to assist the state and local law enforcement and our federal agencies.
Well, you just said state authority allows you to do this. One question that our ranking member has been asking over and over again is, do you know whether in these states do any elected officials have anything to do with these decisions? In other words, where is that authority coming from? And we're trying to figure out, with something affecting so many citizens, whether elected officials have anything to do with it. Do you know?
I do. Only in one state, the state of Illinois, did an elected official sign the MOU. In the other states, they were done so with the state representatives. This is state law that's established at the state level prior to facial recognition and our program getting started. We're just leveraging that state law. That state law is already in place. We did work with the Office of General Counsel at the FBI and the attorney level at the state level.
Well, if it was prior to facial recognition coming into existence, I'm just wondering, do you think that whatever laws you're referring to anticipated something like facial recognition.
It's my understanding that the states established those laws because of fraud and abuse of driver's license. And we are just reviewing each of the state laws and working with the representatives in those states to ensure that we can leverage that again for criminal investigation.
And so when you say leverage, I guess you're saying that there were laws that were out there, these laws did not anticipate something like facial recognition, and now the FBI has decided that it would basically take advantage of those laws. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. And I don't know about you, but I have a driver's license, and I don't remember ever being told that getting a driver's license would put me in an FBI database so that I can be a part of every one of their investigation lineups. And I certainly didn't vote for anyone who was promising to make that happen. And so how is this happening? How are these agreements being made? Well, this is Representative Jim Jordan of Ohio talking to Nima Sin Giuliani. I think that's how you say her name. But she's the senior legislative counsel at the American Civil Liberties Union, also known as the ACLU.
Did the state legislature and the governor actually pass legislation saying it was okay for the FBI to access every single person in their state who has a driver's license? Did that happen in those 18 or 19 states that gave that permission to the FBI?
No, and that's the problem. This was all in secret, essentially.
So some unelected person at the FBI talks to some unelected person at the state level, and they say, yeah, go ahead. Here's, in the case of Ohio, we got 11 million people, most of them drive. Here's 10 million folks who you can now have this database.
Right, and the people who wanted a driver's license many times didn't know these systems were operating either.
And here's former Representative Elijah Cummings of Maryland, RIP, questioning Kimberly Del Greco of the FBI about just how many states have signed up for these DMV photos so far.
Ms. Del Greco, how many states have provided this level of direct access to the FBI?
We do not have direct access. We submit a probe to the state. There's 21 states.
21 states, okay.
And I wasn't able to find a list of what those 21 states are, but that's damn near half the states. And it's not just DMV photos, it's your passport photos too.
And can the FBI perform a face recognition search for any American with a passport?
For an open assessment or an active investigation only by the FBI, sir.
So between all those different databases, how many photos of us does the FBI have access to? Well, here's Greta Goodwin. She's the Director of Homeland Security and Justice at the Government Accountability Office. She's speaking to Representative Jim Jordan of Ohio.
The numbers. Dr. Goodwin, what number of photos does the FBI have access to in just their database?
And just their database, little over 20 plus 36 million.
36 million. And then in the databases that they can then send information to and that are screened and used and there's interaction with at the state level, what is the total number of photos in all those databases?
So access to photos across all the repositories, about 640 million.
640 million photos. Only 330 million people in the country.
So there's roughly 2 photos of each American in the FBI's lineups. And so how often are they lining us up? Here's Representative Carolyn Maloney of New York speaking to Kimberly Del Greco of the FBI.
So, Mrs. Del Greco, how many searches has the FBI run in the Next Generation ID interstate photo system to date? How many searches? Do you have that information?
I have from fiscal year 2017 to April of 2019, there were 152,500 searches.
Put it all together, and here's what's happening in real life. Here's Claire Garvey.
Left unchecked, current police face recognition practices threaten our due process rights. My research has uncovered the fact that police submit what can only be described as garbage data into face recognition systems, expecting valuable leads in return. The NYPD submitted a photo of actor Woody Harrelson to find an unknown suspect in a beer theft. They have submitted photos of suspect whose eyes or mouths have been cut and pasted in from another person's photo, essentially fabricating evidence. Agencies submit drawings of suspects in places of photos as well, despite research showing that this will not work. Worse, officers at times then skip identification procedures and go straight to arresting someone on the basis of a face recognition search. This practice runs counter both to common sense and to departments' own policies. And these practices raise serious concerns about accuracy and the innocence of the person arrested because of a face recognition search.
Now, one saving grace here should be that we know enough about the problems with this technology, from the current inaccuracies to the garbage data that's being used to run the searches, that we should be able to challenge this in court if it's used against us, right? Well, here's Claire Garvey.
These systems produce Brady material, information that under our constitutional right to due process must be turned over to the defense, but it's not.
And the FBI straight up admits that they don't tell defendants when they use this technology. Here's Representative William Lacey Clay of Missouri talking to Kimberly Del Greco of the FBI.
So how many times has the FBI provided notice to criminal defendants that face recognition was used in their case?
As part of a criminal investigation, I don't believe that's part of the process.
And the cherry on top? Here's Representative Jayapal of Washington speaking to FBI Director Christopher Wray on February 5th of this year.
So just to be clear, under current FBI policy, can face recognition technology be used without a warrant or probable cause in any circumstance?
Yes.
Okay, so that is a concern for me, continues to be a concern for me.
And so this is happening because there are very few laws restraining what the FBI can do. And as we heard, the FBI is taking old laws and finding ways to twist them to allow them to use this new technology in partnership with states that are down to play ball. The problem is, and there's many problems, but here's just one of them. One of the problems is that the FBI is not even following the laws that are already on the books. Here's Representative Jim Jordan of Ohio talking to Greta Goodwin of the Government Accountability Office.
Dr. Goodwin, did the FBI publish privacy impact assessment in a timely fashion as it was supposed to when it implemented FRT in 2011?
No.
Did the FBI file proper notice, specifically the system of record notice, in a timely fashion when it implemented facial recognition technology?
No.
Did the FBI conduct proper testing of the next generation interstate photo system when it implemented FRT?
Proper in terms of determining its accuracy for its use?
Yes.
No.
Did the FBI test the accuracy of the state systems that it interfaced with?
No.
And there's one particular legal document that the FBI's actions and local law enforcement actions may very well be defying too. Here's Claire Garvey.
Last year, the Supreme Court in Carpenter noted that for the government to secretly monitor and catalog every one of our movements across time and space violates our right to privacy protected by the Fourth Amendment. Face recognition enables precisely this type of monitoring. But that hasn't stopped Chicago, Detroit, and other cities from acquiring and piloting this capability. The Supreme Court held in NAACP versus Alabama, Talley versus California, and others that the First Amendment protects the right to anonymous speech and association. Face recognition technology threatens to upend this protection.
And so one thing is crystal clear here, and that's that we need our lawmakers to step in and make some laws about if and when this technology can be used in law enforcement, starting from the cop on the beat, on your street, going all the way up to the feds. But it's not just law enforcement. This is being used by the private sector too, in ways that can be problematic in our personal lives. So for example, now that so many of us are unemployed and looking for jobs, the private sector is using facial recognition technology to decide who among us is a worthy employee. Here's Representative Deb Holland of New Mexico questioning Meredith Whitaker, who is the co-founder and co-director of the AI Now Institute.
I recently read that some employers have begun using facial recognition technology to help decide who to hire. At certain companies, such as Hilton and Unilever, job applicants can complete video interviews using their computer or cell phone cameras, which collect data on characteristics like an applicant's facial movements, vocal tone, and word choice. One company offering this technology, HireView, collects up to 500,000 data points in a 30-minute interview. The algorithm then ranks the applicant against other applicants based on the so-called employability score. Job applicants who look and sound like the current high performers at the company receive the highest scores. Ms. Whitaker, I have two questions for you. One, isn't it true that the use of facial recognition and characterization technology in job application processes may contribute to biases in hiring practices? And if yes, can you please elaborate?
It is absolutely true. And the scenario that you described so well is a scenario in which you create a biased feedback loop, in which the people who are already rewarded and promoted and hired to a firm become the models for what a good employee looks like. So if you look at the executive suite at Goldman Sachs, which also uses HireVue for this type of hiring, you see a lot of men, a lot of white men. And if that becomes the model for what a successful worker looks like, and then that is used to judge whether my face looks successful enough to get a job interview at Goldman Sachs, we're going to see a kind of confirmation bias in which people are excluded from opportunity because they happen not to look like the people who had already been hired.
Then there's Facebook, which has some plans to change the way we shop. Here's Joy Bolen-Weenie, founder of the Algorithmic Justice League, answering questions posed by Representative Jamie Raskin of Maryland.
So Facebook has a patent where they say, because we have all of these face prints collected often without consent, we can now give you an option as a retailer to identify somebody who walks into the store. And in their patent, they say we can also give that face a trustworthiness score. And based on that trustworthiness score, we might determine if you have access or not to a valuable good. So
Facebook is selling this now?
This is a patent that they filed, as in something that they could potentially do with the capabilities they have. So as we're talking about state surveillance, we absolutely have to be thinking about corporate surveillance as well.
And we're not powerless here, or at least our Congress isn't, and we're supposed to be in charge of our Congress. But our Congress can put limits on all of this, whether it's government use or whether it's corporate use. And we don't even have to expect them to come up with new laws because the European Union already has some good ones. And so we have the option to just copy them. Here's Joy Bolen-Weenie again speaking to Representative Michael Cloud of Texas.
Ms. Bolen-Weenie, did I say that right? Okay.
Yes, you did.
You mentioned Facebook in your remarks, and I find that interesting because I'm extremely concerned about the government having this kind of unchecked ability. I would be curious to get your thoughts of corporations having the same sort of ability, and also Ms. Garvey and Ms. Giuliani, if you want to speak to that too.
Absolutely. So you're looking at a platform that has over 2.6 billion users. And over time, Facebook has been able to amass enormous facial recognition capabilities using all of those photos that we tagged without our permission. What we're seeing is that we don't necessarily have to accept this as the default. So in the EU, where GDPR was passed, because there's a provision for biometric data consent, they actually have an option where you have to opt in. Right now, we don't have that in the US, and that's something we could immediately require today.
And so whether we follow the European Union's lead or if we have our lawmakers create an American version of laws about facial recognition technology, it's clear that Congress has to regulate this. Here's Representative Katie Hill, or at least she used to be a representative before she got caught in a throuple and resigned out of shame. But yeah, she used to be a representative, and here she is speaking in a May 2019 hearing. To Andrew Ferguson, who is a law professor at the University of the District of Columbia.
Professor Ferguson, do you think that the Supreme Court can rule quickly enough upon the use of these technologies as the cases arise to thwart constitutionally questionable uses?
They can, but they won't do as good a job as Congress regulating it now. Justice Alito has repeatedly made that claim, and I think he's correct to say that this kind of technology should be regulated first by Congress. The Fourth Amendment floor will exist, and the Supreme Court will address it, but this body has the primary responsibility to regulate in this field.
And so what should those laws look like? Well, the Electronic Frontier Foundation has some suggestions. First, they want the collection of our data limited to the minimum necessary, and the government should be prohibited from using DMV records for their fishing expeditions. Second, there should be clear rules on when facial recognition is and is not allowed to be used, and warrants should be required prior to the collection and search of image databases. Third, they say that there should be limits on the amount and type of data that can be stored, and there should be requirements for deleting the data after a certain amount of time. Fourth, they want different kinds of biometric data to be stored in different databases. So like one database for photos, one database for fingerprints, and they should not be stored together for data security reasons. Fifth, there should be clear and limited rules for use and sharing our images that are collected for non-criminal reasons. So when we go to get a driver's license, we're not criminals. And that's one of the reasons that that database shouldn't be handed over to the feds for them to search through. Sixth, we should be notified when our data, our images, fingerprints, whatever, is going to be stored and possibly shared with law enforcement. And then seventh, there should be independent oversight over all this shit. And if we have thoughts on this, now is the time to start speaking up, to write emails, to write letters, to make phone calls to our representatives in Congress, even though we're in the middle of all this COVID stuff, because these committees are still working over Zoom. Because they've been having hearings on this issue, as you just heard, consistently for the last year. And members of both parties are ready to write a law while very few of us are paying attention. But one encouraging thing that I did witness is that members of both parties seem to be suspicious of what's going on in law enforcement and in the corporate sector when it comes to the expansion of facial recognition technologies. And so, for example, here's Representative Jim Jordan of Ohio, who, for better and oftentimes worse, is one of the leaders of this current Republican Party in the House of Representatives. And here's what he's thinking that the first round of legislation on this should look like.
First part of what we hope will be legislation that we can have broad support on, that the chairman and both Republicans and Democrats can support, is tell us what's going on now. And then second, while we're trying to figure that out, while the study and we're getting an accountability and what's all happening, let's not expand it. Let's just start there. Tell us what you're doing and don't do anything while we're trying to figure out what you're doing. And then once we get that information, then we can move from there. That is what I hope we can start with, Madam Chair, and frankly, what we've been working with now for a year, staffs for both the majority and the minority.
And so they are working on this, but right now they're doing so without our input. And so let's never forget that they work for you and I. And so this is an excellent opportunity, especially in an election year, for you to speak up and be heard about the rules that you want to see put in place on facial recognition technology and how it should be allowed to be used. But in the meantime, while facial recognition technology is still being used in the wild west of legal lawlessness, there is one way that you can protect yourself. Wear your damn mask. Okay, that's it for today. Wasn't that a lovely break from COVID? Even though it even snuck into this episode a few times. But yeah, if you enjoy this episode or any of the other work that I've done, any of the other episodes, please support this podcast. The ways to support are all linked for you in every episode's show notes, along with the sources. Unfortunately, I think I'm going to have to go back to some COVID reporting for the next episode because Congress is back from vacation. Finally. And there have been some interesting hearings. Some you may have heard of because, yes, Dr. Fauci is back and he did testify, but there's also some hearings that were probably not on your radar. So I'm going to watch those. And we're going to keep documenting this crazy part of our history because I know that Congress is considering passing another CARES Act type of piece of legislation. And so I really want us to document what they are being told while they're writing that law. And so when it finally gets passed, we can judge what they did against what information they were given by the experts. So until then, stay safe. And you can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Jen Briney in both locations. Please reach out to me. But yeah, I appreciate all of you producers. Thank you so much for helping me continue to do this show. Again, you can be a producer and be a part of this by visiting congressionaldish.com. Thank you so much. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it lies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.